Alright, so today I want to start off with just a little bit on my hometown. So I'm from Syracuse, Utah. We're the average Utah suburb. We just got a Walmart like 5 years ago, so think about that. That's about the size we are. But in 2012, so that was my senior year, Utah had 545 suicides, and 17 of those were from my, at that time, smaller town of Syracuse. And a couple of my friends were actually some of those who committed suicide. And a lot of things go into suicide. There's mental health, there's emotions, there's bullying, there's social media. So many things go into what contributes to a suicide. But today I want to talk about a factor that I think is a very greatly contributing factor that not a lot of people think about, and that's the media, in specifics the news, and how suicide is reported in the news, and how that affects suicide. So I asked on my social media about, should suicide be reported in the news? And it was interesting, over 100 people responded and also commented, and it's about 50-50. 51% says yes, it should be reported in the news, but 49% said that no, it should not. And what I found interesting is, so I went through the comments afterwards and was kind of looking at them, and they range in so many different backgrounds. Opinions come from everywhere. Some people say, I don't think that getting this attention would ever make someone decide to commit suicide, but it could help in the process. Then other people say mental health needs to be talked about much more than it currently is. Some people just flat out said nope, or suicide needs to be reported to increase awareness. So I can see both ends. We need to talk about suicide. It shouldn't be something that we just shove under the rug and not address ever. But should it be reported in the news, and how should it be reported in the news? Now, I'm also in a persuasion class where I'm learning about all of these different kinds of social proof, and there's a thing called the Werther effect. And this was a book that came out in 1784, I think, and it was written by a German author, and it's called The Sorrows of Young Werther, and it's about a man, and the hero of the story commits suicide. Now what was interesting is as soon as this book came out and people started reading it, suicides in Europe jumped immediately. And even some countries in Europe banned this book because it was becoming such an epidemic in Europe. And it's been coined the Werther effect now. It's also known more commonly as the copycat suicide effect in the media today, which, looking at this graph, this was in one of the books I read, and it talks about, so this is when 1 month before a story in the news on suicide is reported, and as soon as that story that is reported, suicides skyrocket for the next 2 months. And this has a lot to do with varying factors. One of the reasons that a lot of researchers think is called social proof. And social proof is when you see someone who is in your same situation, looks similar to you, has a similar background, you're more likely to be persuaded by them. So when news reports different suicides in the news, if they have, let's say it's someone who's a teenager, you're a teenager, they report that they were going through some bullying, you're going through some bullying. They, were a female, you're a female. They lived in this certain demographic, they had these certain problems, you're going through that same problem. It can be seen as social proof and seen as a way to get out of the problem. And so when news report these different kinds of suicides, they need to be careful about how they're reported. Because if you're making it more of like a memorial to this person, this is how they kind of got out of the problem, then people watching it are more likely to kind of respond to that and feel that that is a way that they can get out of theirs as well. And there were some other studies done that I read about that also show that people who are having these suicidal thoughts tend to latch on closer to people who are more like them, and a lot of news sources, they don't provide the resources. They might put up a number on the screen. It was funny, I actually talked about this today in my news class. I'm a news media major, and it came up today, suicide in the news. And it was interesting that the only thing they said about it was that, just make sure, you might want to put a little graphic on the bottom that says a number to call. But that was it. It was like focusing on everything else about suicide and not really even talking about resources. So I found that very interesting that came up today. And this is also a very common, very prevalent suicide story in the media today. This is a Netflix series called 13 Reasons Why. And I've actually watched only the first season because I actually felt myself kind of being drawn into these kind of feelings of depression, anxiety, which I read a lot of articles about why this is a great series and why this is also a very harmful series. And this goes right back to kind of into what the news media has to do with it. This is a very, it talks about very difficult things that kids go through. I'm not going to name them all, but there are some really bad kind of socially taboo subjects that this series addresses. And one of them is suicide and a lot of other things. But what it also does is it sensationalizes and glorifies a little bit on how this girl kind of got out of her situation. And this was a way for her to kind of get back at the people she thought hurt her the most, which, a double-edged sword. It addresses all of these concerns, but also can show these kids that this is a way to get out of this problem. And it can be taken either way, which as I was doing my research, it was interesting, the American Foundation Preventing Suicide American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, they have a whole site dedicated to just this show and suicide in general. And they say that graphic depictions that don't offer hope, which this show kind of doesn't, can produce a contagion effect, so contagious over-the effect, the copycat effect. And that goes right with the news as well. So when news sources don't offer the hopeful side that comes with a suicide story, that's where this contagion effect, that's where this Werther effect comes into play, and that we see that spike. And so we want to make sure that as we're watching the news, if we notice a story, like maybe when we have kids or we have our family, we're sitting there and we notice a story that comes on that is suicide, and maybe the news outlet didn't give those sources, they didn't give that side of that point of view, that we have those conversations with those that we love. It's our role as friends and family to have these tough conversations with people. The news is often not correct and often doesn't portray what we want them to. So it's really our job to make sure that we're the ones that are giving that to the people around us, that we're the ones giving that love, we're showing that compassion, and we're showing that there is another option other than suicide, and that it affects those around them. It's not an option, it's not a solution to what they're going through. And so whether or not you write to a news station and tell them that you're disappointed or that you want them to change something, or whether you're just talking to those around you and making it not a taboo subject, I think that suicide is something we need to always incorporate into the lives of those we love. Thank you.